like Olivia said, we had a slightly different aspects on this project. My we worked together on developing the proposal last semester, on writing some content for the narrative, et cetera. And then later at the end of last semester and this semester, I've moved more into addressing this question of appropriate regions of scale for climate adaptation planning, paying attention to how the impacts of spatial and to some extent temporal scales impact compound flood adaptation in Detroit, and what that might mean for GLISA's engagements and work plan moving forward. So for some reason that bar is up there and the formatting didn't translate from PowerPoint to Google Slides, but ignore any formatting issues. Anyways, so just for the overview and knowledge gap, there's been extensive discussion in the fields of geography and natural resource planning around the role of spatial scale and at what spatial scales planning should take place. And this has been sort of moving into the adaptation sector recently, but is an incredibly important and sort of under-researched aspect of climate planning. Because scale, and particular spatial scale, really affects how decision makers see trade-offs and co-benefits associated with solutions, right? So a classic example is someone acting in isolation, maybe like a homeowner, might put up a seawall in front of their house, but that could increase coastal erosion downstream. And in the same way, top-down approaches to planning that may be more high-level can overlook community needs and nuances. So finding those sort of appropriate regions for scale is really important. And so I wanted to sort of apply this idea to compound flooding in Detroit and investigate some of these questions of, how does scale impact the stakeholders involved in decision-making and planning, how it affects their views on trade-off and co-benefits both in the past and maybe in the future, and whether we can from that identify more appropriate regions for scale, or more appropriate regions of scale for planning moving forward, and how GLISA might be able to be involved in this. So just to step out for a little bit, Detroit has been experiencing increasing flooding in the last 10 years. Flooding is the #1 climate threat facing the world and the United States. It's the leading cause of natural disaster deaths and property damage, both globally and here. Compound flooding especially is expected to increase in the coming decades, and coastal cities are incredibly vulnerable because the effects of compound flooding can be exacerbated by previous socioeconomic disparities, urbanization, and failing infrastructure. Detroit is already seeing the impacts, having had 2 500-year floods in the span of 7 years in 2014 and 2021, and pretty much some level of flooding in the city every year since 2014 moving forward, including just a few months ago. And this represents a huge equity and public health issue. Not just the cost burden associated with constantly having to repair your home, but flooding can cause mold to build up, increasing rates of asthma, floodwaters, especially in Detroit with the combined sewage overflow system, which I'll get to later, can be really toxic, causing gastrointestinal disease, and all of these problems are more prevalent in communities that are frequently flooded, and in low-income and minority communities, which are also frequently flooded. This is just a map from Wayne State University survey showing frequent flooding hotspots in Detroit. You can see some areas, especially on the east side and along the coast. So I wanted to start looking into this question by trying to evaluate the physical scales and the physical climate scales at work to get a sense for what was increasing compound flood risk in Detroit. And so I started with lake levels. The Great Lakes area sees fluctuating lake levels, but recently it's been seeing higher highs, lower lows, more rapid fluctuations between extremes. It's been said that the Great Lakes have seen, a few feet of sea level rise in just a few years, and these trends are projected to increase in the future. These are sort of governed by longer-term, more regional trends in temperature and precipitation, as well as sort of international transboundary water agreements and large control structures that, to a certain extent, can help regulate lake levels. The flooding in 2019 in Lake Ontario, for example, releases from the Moses Saunders Dam alleviated about a foot of sea level rise or lake level increase. But when you're talking about 3 to 6 feet of increases and flooding across the region, it's not only a political decision, but it's kind of not doing as much as you would want it to. The other impact here is extreme precipitation. Annual averages have been relatively stable, but extreme events not so much. The amount of rain falling in the most intense events has increased dramatically since 1960 and is projected to increase even more by 2100. And in Detroit, like many cities in America, and across the world, extreme precipitation and stormwater is managed by a complex system of infrastructure and sewers. Detroit has one of the oldest sewer systems in the United States, even older than many East Coast cities, and is a combined system that pumps both home sewage and stormwater. And it's sort of, unfortunately, if you could design a system to perfectly increase compound flood vulnerability, the system in Detroit is kind of what you would end up with. I mean, it's a huge sprawling regional system that pumps large amounts, that's overbuilt in the suburbs, it's underbuilt in the city. It pumps large amounts of stormwater from the entire region into areas in coastal Detroit, where when the infrastructure fails, the water floods to the surface or in people's homes and in basements. The system for a variety of regions, which I'm happy to talk about later, but won't get into now, has seen a significant amount of disinvestment over the last half century, and it is failing. It's estimated by the Great Lakes Water Authority, which controls the system, that it would cost $1 billion a year every year from now until 2045 to get the system back up to snuff and in perfect working condition. But even if that was true and it functioned perfectly, it's still not built for the climate that we have today. It's designed to manage a 3-inch precipitation event in a day, and we've seen events that go 5 to 8 inches in some areas and have dumped up to 3 inches of rain over the course of a few hours. So, yeah, it's not designed for this climate. It's perfectly designed to increase compound flood vulnerability in these coastal areas that are already increasingly vulnerable. So, in addition to being a climate issue, obviously is a policy issue as well. So just a brief overview of the role of kind of spatial scales in policy and issue construction. You know, scale is a essential component of policy issue construction. It sets the bounds on the types of problems to be addressed, the solutions to be had, and how impacts are evaluated. It's definitely not politically neutral because it impacts trade-offs and co-benefits in these ways. The choice of scale can act to privilege certain actors over others and enforce different priorities. Hilda Kurtz, who's a geographer from the University of Georgia, who's done extensive work on this in the realm of environmental justice, talks about how environmental issues are kind of inherently characterized by this spatial ambiguity with no explicit rationale for favoring one scale of planning over another. So there tends to be tensions and different actors working at competing scales to try and emphasize different priorities. In Detroit, flooding has been sort of addressed at two very distinct and sort of isolated scales. One is the neighborhood scale and the other is the more regional scale. I'm going to talk about the latter first a little bit. Also, I should just pause for a second if anyone had any like interrupting, clarifying questions. Okay, all right. So at the regional scale, which I'm going to roughly characterize as the Southeast Michigan Council of Government, kind of which maps pretty well to the Great Lakes Water Authority, which is the regional utility. It was formed after the city's bankruptcy, and there was a lot of drama around that. Anyways, it has a very kind of specific set of priorities planning around stormwater infrastructure at this scale. They release 2 to 5 year capital improvement plans every year. They have a wastewater master plan that goes out 40 years. There's little to no mention of equity or justice or marginalized communities in that type of planning process. It's more focused on upgrades to the system, regional economic development, long-term planning, and it really affects the kind of solutions that are on the tables for flooding issues. Even things like green stormwater infrastructure that may have had, kind of considered to be sort of equity and justice co-benefits associated with them aren't really discussed in that terms. It's more of a, like I said, quality of life, household value, regional economic development. These are the things that are considered co-benefits when considering solutions like that at this scale. There's also issues with collaboration between folks like the Great Lakes Water Authority who don't own any land, individual homeowners who would have to site green stormwater infrastructure, people who own highways, et cetera. I think that Jefferson Chalmers, a neighborhood in East Side Detroit, is a perfect example of this sort of neighborhood scale framing some of these issues. For those who don't know, Jefferson Chalmers is on the east side of Detroit. It's characterized by an extensive series of canals that connect to the Detroit River and are thus connected to lake levels and lake level rises and falls. And they also make up, to a large extent, the fabric of the community. Folks there feel like this is, the character of the neighborhood. It's treated often in the media as the flooding that's been recurring there for the last decade or so, but also in history, but more frequently in the last decade or so, as sort of a human interest story. It's reinforced through media articles, sort of as, here are some maligned residents, we'll go and interview them. These are the issues, maybe some mention of, broader systemic issues, but generally, again, it's treated more as a local human interest story. This frame is also reinforced by institutional research planning from folks, not just at, academic institutions, but also by the city, by federal agencies. An example being, there was a large controversy around FEMA, who went in and designated most of the neighborhood in the 100-year floodplain as opposed to the 500-year floodplain following the floods in 2021. In response, home insurance premiums spiked for residents, and the Army Corps of Engineers was commissioned to come and do a study of how to remove the neighborhood from the floodplain and what solutions may be viable there. The solutions that came out were things like constructing extensive seawalls through people's property, closing off the canals from the river, or increasing or maintaining things like tiger dams, which you can see are the orange kind of ugly inflatable dams there that kind of just went up during flood instances, and people don't really like that. But again, there was consideration sort of these broader systemic issues, like the Army Corps mentioned that, instituting seawalls would prevent water from draining through the neighborhood in an extreme precipitation scenario, or it would prevent the Great Lakes Water Authority from flushing combined sewer overflow through these canals, which happens during extreme precipitation events. And it would mess with these broader systemic things, but there was no redressment or management of those issues because, again, it was focused at the neighborhood scale specifically, and that was their mandate. So there's a general sense, I think, that this, in addition to isolating the neighborhoods from kind of broader systemic solutions and sources of funding, it also sort of shows this trade-off of immediate relief from flood issues versus broader systemic reform. It's like, this is what we have to do here at the neighborhood scale. And, any resistance is sort of portrayed as obstructionism. Folks don't want to get on board. The city throws up their hands. What are we going to do if all these homeowners can't buy in? But it's because you have this top-down approach that's also perpetuating this very kind of neighborhood local scale frame, and this contributes to marginalization of these areas. I think this image is a pretty good example. What you see on the left-hand side is the mostly white, suburban, wealthier community of Grosse Pointe Park. They have a publicly owned, well-maintained seawall along the canal. They don't flood during precipitation events. On the right-hand side, you have Jefferson Chalmers, which is a much lower income, mostly Black community. And there's these tiger dams that were mandated by the city, sandbags, sort of a command and control way to control flooding. But again, there are issues with scale here too, right? Because you have to get all the property owners on board if you wanted to do something like a seawall. Whereas in Grosse Pointe Park across the way, that's a public right of way. The city can collectively act and maintain that seawall. All right. So aside from these two approaches, there have been proposals to adopt a watershed scale planning approach. This is seen a big push in the last 20 years in environment and natural resource planning generally. There's a lot of countries that have instituted this, not just for water management, but also for agriculture, land management, forestry. It's been implemented for flooding in places like the Netherlands, for sea level rise in places like Australia. But I think one of the major issues is that it's hard to separate physical features from the kind of context in which they exist. These are jointly combined systems. They're not just separate things. No matter how much city planners of the past would like them to be so. The picture on the right is from a Graham Sustainability Institute report showing the natural water sheds in the city of Detroit on the bottom, and the sewer sheds and the sewer service districts that were constructed on the top. They bear little to no resemblance to each other, and that's how the system was built. But the University of Michigan researchers have pushed this approach in the past. I think one of the problems on the table is that there's not a clear sense of how this will work in practice, what it would look like, what the implementability would be, how much it would cost, and whether there are any sort of win-wins that we could find going forward that wouldn't foreclose opportunities to implement something like this in the future, but wouldn't sort of delay us in years of planning that could lead to further of these impacts where we could just act to upgrade the current system today. Anyways, lacking a comprehensive and viable approach for an alternate kind of planning scale, I think that the GLISA engagements and workshops around scenario planning should really focus on helping bridge the existing scale disconnects between this kind of neighborhood scale focus and these broader system-wide issues and planning capacities. This could look like bringing folks from the FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers into workshops with folks from the city and the Great Lakes Water Authority. Also, we have design community workshops to help bring those community needs and priorities to those bigger regional scales as well. This could leverage federal funding and expertise that's right now, working to maybe even further marginalize communities like Jefferson Chalmers and maybe bring it to more of a system-wide approach. Scenario planning, for a lot of the reasons that Olivia had talked about, is really conducive to this process because it's not coming in with a, this is the solution that we want to, approach with. It's more of a organic process of, here are the potential futures that we could face and what does the collaboration, look like across these different actors working at different scales. And I think just moving forward, it's really important to think about the spatial and to an extent temporal scales involved and the tensions that arise from those, especially when you're doing work around potentially sensitive issues like this and bringing all of these folks together at the table. And so being cognizant of, where priorities are, what the scales people are working on, and how that impacts what they see as a benefit and a trade-off is really important. And if anyone is more interested about detail on those things, they can read the paper that I've put out, or not put out, but will be circulated about this project moving forward. So anyways, that's it. Questions?